Let's see. So I'll start. Okay. Um, so we wanted to talk about a key question that comes up as we talk to legislators and other people about what we're doing, and that's basically why cities, and what do we hope to accomplish by having them push the agenda of sustainable development. So we'll talk about why cities are such a powerful force and how we can take advantage of their unique structure to push our agenda. And the thing is, in the context of world history, cities have never been as dynamic, as resourceful, and as important as they are right now. And they pose some of the most daunting problems of our century, but they also provide us with unique possibilities to resolve them. And while our federal government might not be interested in participating in the Paris Agreement, that's actually not a bad thing because cities are where we should be focusing anyway, and now we've been given the opportunity. So I'll talk a little bit about sustainable development because that's the opinion, that's the way that we've chosen to look at the issue. And it's a way of both looking at the world and a way of solving global problems. So it combines the interactions of the world economy, the global society, and Earth's physical environment. So what we're looking for is socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable economic growth, which is all under the umbrella of good governance. So it's not only an ideal to strive for, it's also a way to arrive at that ideal because we want a world that's socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and it's growing economically, but we can't achieve one without achieving the others. So it's all about finding solutions to all our problems by by recognizing how interconnected they all are.
So why cities exactly? What makes cities distinct and why should we focus on them? Well, before we talk about why we're working on cities, we need to understand them better. Cities are classified as densely populated, urban or suburban areas. They're home to industry, services, and they're highly innovative because they're often home to universities and research labs. Urban income, depending on the city, can be up to triple the amount of rural income as people migrate from rural to urban areas. There's an increase in national productivity, therefore stimulating our nation's economy. Cities are trading centers. They exist to facilitate trade, which make them dynamic and cosmopolitan. Coastal cities combine these advantages with the advantage of lower costs for sea-based shipping. They're often at estuaries of great rivers, which connect the city to the interior of the country.
So cities are unique in that they're the only places on the face of the planet that are actually growing right now because the rural population has peaked. And that's not actually a bad thing because it means that if we're making our city sustainable, we're reducing most of the world's emissions. And it's another example of a daunting problem that cities face, but one that actually works in our favor if we resolve it. And so one thing to understand is also that cities face glaring inequality. The poor and the rich live side by side in close proximity. If you take New York, for example, some of the richest parts of America, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, exist next to some of the poorest parts, like Harlem to the north of the Upper East Side. And some of the economic advantages of cities are pretty decent. They offer large markets, which enhances their productivity and makes them them have a range of enormous activities and depth of specialization. And that's called having an economy of scope. And they also have an economy of scale because they can produce things at a grand scale. And so some of the challenges that cities face as a result of their high density and their economic activities are pollution of air and water, traffic congestion, rapid transmission of diseases. Many cities have to face high rates of crime and violence because they have such a densely packed population. But that can actually also work in our favor because it can provide, well, not the violence bit, the densely populated bit, because it can provide easier access to public services and pollution can be controlled through infrastructure and we can police crime in such small areas.
Awesome. So, and not only are cities very unique, but they're also very essential right now. I don't think any of you need an explanation for what's going on in national politics, but the reality is that with the current administration, things just aren't happening, and it's not likely that what's going to happen that needs to happen is that sentence is not going to finish well. what we need to happen is not going to happen at the national level. So yeah, and I don't know as much about Canadian politics really, but I'm sure that it's just as difficult to get things, maybe not just as, but still very difficult to get things done at the national level. And rather than waiting for another 2-3 years to elect another administration, it's really important that we start working now to get the change that we need, because the reality is that we don't have time to wait until we get a new president. And even at the state level, like, things are still very difficult, and it obviously depends on the state. But you still have that like big party dynamic in this ideological battle where state and federal politicians are very much associated with political parties, and obviously climate change has become a very political issue, and Republicans are terrified to say that they believe in climate change and be willing to do anything about it. But we don't really see that same partisan divide at the local level, where if local leaders are clearly affiliated with a political party, they aren't held to as much pressure to stick to that party's platform. So there's just a lot more opportunity to be able to get things done at cities, whereas the higher we go in like geographic area, the more politics kind of get in the way with that. But cities are also, besides that, cities are also really important just because the majority of our emissions actually come from cities. So actually 70% of our emissions come from cities, which is a lot. So like even small cities, so like this isn't even just like the New Yorks and the Chicagos and those types of cities. Even the small cities where a lot of our campaigns are making a big difference, because most of our emissions don't come from rural areas. So acting in cities is really important. And as Kashfi was kind of talking about, the population in cities is still growing. So whereas now 70% of our emissions come from cities, cities are getting a lot bigger. So it's going to be even a bigger proportion of our emissions that are coming from cities. So 81% of Americans right now live in urban areas, which is a huge amount. And so focusing our action on where the people are and where they're actually contributing to the problem is really important.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the unique thing about cities is that they have the opportunity to try out different approaches to finding a solution. Rather than our country speaking on behalf of all of us and coming up with a single solution, there's no one way to, like, no one right way to fix it. And the fact that it's different people working in different cities opens up a door for new ideas and like better ways to go about doing things, and that's always a good thing, to have more sides to the story. For example, in New York City, the challenge of providing such a large population with safe, reliable, and accessible water has been addressed through the Catskill and Corton watersheds. And the water and like varying, and being able to provide that water through underground pipes. Well, this water, however, proved to be contaminated by different farms and factories that were in the nearby area. And rather than pay to have the water cleaned every time, the New York City opted to ensure the heads of the farms and factories would use sustainable practices when disposing of their waste by providing them with a financial incentive that in the end proved to be a better use of the money, because they ended up spending less money giving the giving the factories financial incentive than they would have if they were to just continue to clean the water all the time. So I'm gonna have to you guys might not see me for the second part, but because I have to look at it from somewhere else. But basically, taking action at the local level is also more feasible because local leaders are so much more accessible than state or federal. Because they work in a much smaller geography, they obviously have much fewer constituents, and thus it is much easier to have your voice heard, like Rebecca was just saying. So local leaders are often overlooked for grassroots actions, especially by young people, and tend to be much more willing to talk with and listen to you. Just going to a meeting and speaking is already making a huge impact because it's not something they're accustomed to seeing as state and federal politicians are. Another benefit of working on such a small geographic scale is that your work can be more powerful. In the case of cities, you are approaching leaders that live and work near you. You may have neighbors or family friends on the city council. Those kind of personal connections matter, and they make all the differences when you're talking about this issue on moral terms. When you can go and say that you want to work together to make the city that you all love and share a better place to live for everyone, you tap into a powerful place-based connection that has the potential to bridge ideological divides.
Awesome. Yeah, and so we are actually seeing that action in cities is not only potentially a good option, but actually happening and making a huge difference. So one example of this, I don't know how many of you have heard of Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign, but it's a national campaign trying to get cities to commit to 100% renewable energy, and they've been super successful, a ton of grassroots action. They have 5 cities that are already powered by 100% renewable energy and 45 that have committed to getting there. So they've set a date that they're going to get to 100% renewable energy by. And again, these are very grassroots groups of people going to their cities and saying that we want this, and cities are doing it. So it's really awesome. And if you're interested in it, they have lots of case studies. One of them, I don't know if it's already powered by 100% renewable energy or if it's committed, but it was definitely one of the first cities. It's Georgetown, Texas, which is super conservative. And it's a really interesting story about how they did it. They made it all about economics, and it was really cool. So, and then another example of action being taken in cities is what happened after the Paris Climate Agreement, after the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So you can see all of these green shapes are cities that have committed to staying into the Paris Climate Agreement. So it is more than 350 cities. That's super awesome, and still more committing both to the Ready for 100 and the Paris Climate Commitment all the time. So it's really cool. And these cities are really taking actions that the state and federal government just aren't supporting or doing, with renewable energy and adopting aggressive emissions reduction targets, implementing climate action plans. So it's really cool, and we really are seeing these kinds of things happen at the local level.
So 2 strategies that we can adopt when we make our resolution is mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is obviously you reduce your carbon emissions. And so at iMatter, we have a questionnaire that we get our cities to respond to. And I found it to be a really useful tool because you can see what are the different places that the city needs to work in. So for example, our city doesn't compost. So that's definitely something that we're going to be putting into our resolution. So it's all about, like we mentioned before, how each solution is uniquely tailored to the city that you're working in. And also, smart infrastructure really matters when you talk about mitigation. So I'm going to give our example, America. America has one of the biggest carbon emissions ever because our infrastructure is not conducive to like minimizing emissions. So if you look at the city of Dallas Fort Worth, it's grown a lot in the past couple of years, but it's sort of like grown into like an urban sprawl. It hasn't taken a sort of like cities in Singapore. They sort of design their infrastructure in a linear way, but Dallas Fort Worth just like expanded, and so like people when they go to work, they commute through like cars, and so they waste a lot of energy doing that, and it like creates a lot of traffic. So this is why America has such a big carbon footprint, because our infrastructure is not um, tailored towards minimizing emissions. So that's definitely something that we should address in our report card and like in our resolutions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, along with mitigation, it is vital that we include adaptation in our strategy. So far, we've discussed the benefits of working in cities as opposed to the state or national level. Well, we've also discussed how to go about implementing our ideas in the framework of our city's sustainable path, and it's very easy to become very dedicated to a certain idea of how things are going to go. If you have a plan, you want to stick to it as religiously as possible, but things don't always work out like that. So consider adaptation as your contingency plan. Cities are at the root of expanding concepts of sustainability, and consequently, so they're at the root of expanding sustainability, and uh, sorry,
You're good.
um, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Um, well, sustainable development in cities is such a large issue that we can't afford not having a backup. Cities are at the so like I said, cities are at the root of expanding concepts of sustainability and consequently saving our planet. Not only do we need to reduce our emissions and energy consumption, we need to also acknowledge that climate change is going to get worse along the way. As that happens, we need to be prepared every step of the way to adapt to any severe situations that might throw a wrench in our plans. So environmental activism is not for the faint of heart. The success of our goals is a matter of how committed we are to the cause. Such a big goal can not be achieved half-heartedly. If and only if we're willing to work hard for it, can any significant accomplishment actually be made. Yeah. And so, and so we have to work to engage stakeholders, which is us. We are the people that are going to be affected by it most. So we are the ones that have to fix it. Nobody else is going to do it for us.
I mean, I'm just gonna add a last word here about engaging with stakeholders. So like, what really matters is when people who are actually like affected by the issue come up to talk to our city council and like let them know this is something that impacts us, and that's the youth. And that's what we're doing here. That's why what we're doing matters so much, because we're the stakeholders and we have to push it through.